She stood before the glittering gate of the banquet like a ghost, a thin scarf clinging to the rain-dark hair on her skull, and the video that called her "old woman begging leftovers" had already circled every phone between the markets and the mosques, promising immediate ruin. The landlord would now demand back rent, the school would call to remove her grandson, and the little patch of rented room with its red earth yard after rain could be lost by week's end. Who would step in when a city of millions decided that a grandmother was entertainment and not a person with a name, a history, and debts? Who among the polished guests behind the electric gate, a senator, a soap opera face, or some hidden magnate, would feel the weight of that shame and do something that mattered? She felt every eye in the live stream as if it were a slap, and then someone in a car she could not see clicked a camera one more time as the gate closed, leaving the question of rescue hanging as the engine hummed away. Mama Halima lived by the river of small mercies, where vendors in Lagos called her by name, and the Danfo horns were as familiar as prayer calls. She earned what little she could selling akara by day, mending nets at dusk, and keeping her grandson, little Musa, fed and in school with a dignity that had been hard-won after her husband's early death. Her values were simple and stubborn. "We don't beg for more than we need," she would tell Musa as she smoothed his hair, and "we give to those hungrier than us," she would add when someone at the market left a stale yam for her. The video titled "Old Woman Was Humiliated for Begging Leftovers" splintered that ordinary world into shards, and the people who had been her neighbors now passed with lowered eyes or loud laughter. No one quite like family, she thought, could understand how shame curdled with hunger. "Come with me, Mama. We'll get you." You cleaned up and on the front page of Good Works. And Halima, desperate and proud at once, accepted, trusting the kindness as a mother trusts a passerby in a storm. The kindness was a promise, but promises, Halima had learned, often come with a price tag attached. What did Mrs. Adetokunbo truly want with Halima's story? When Halima accepted Mrs. Adetokunbo's offer, the wolf in sheep's clothing revealed itself slowly. At first the woman fed her steaming bowls and draped a borrowed wrapper over her shoulders, but then she asked for interviews, for staged photos, and finally insisted Halima sign a paper that made the grandmother's story company property. "For your benefit," she lied, and Halima, unable to read the fine print by the flickering generator light in the charity's office, signed because she understood the shape of hunger more than the shape of contracts. The second obstacle hit like harmattan breath in her lungs when the signature cleared, and the charity sold her name to a lifestyle brand that used the footage for advertising without paying Halima a naira, painting her as a prop in a campaign that both claimed to help and profited from her humiliation. The market women whispered that she was being used, while the influencer who had first recorded her returned to laugh at how viral misery could be monetized. Halima asked herself, who would rescue a grandmother once she had been turned into an image for someone else's wealth, and who would answer for those who smiled with the drip of charity but kept the coins? Time shifted with a new, cold urgency. The landlord delivered a 3-day notice, the clinic demanded payment before little Musa's fever could be fully treated, and the viral clip attracted The inciting moment arrived at a wedding under 100 golden lights where the orchestra drowned out the rain. Halima had wandered past the gate after the leftover platters piled high had been carted away, hoping for a scrap. And the socialite at the gate, a woman who sold glamour like fabric, shoved Halima and snapped, "Go pick your begging from the gutter," while a security guard laughed and a nearby influencer filmed every trembling step. The clip spread so quickly that the landlord knocked the next morning, and the word in the mosque courtyard was already a rumor of theft rather than need, tilting Halima's life toward eviction, and Mustafa, the landlord, who had once been kind, now wore a stern face and a new tenant list that did not include them. Halima felt the sting of injustice cut deeper than the rain had, and somewhere beyond the gate, under a dark car, a man in an expensive suit looked through his rain-splattered window and thought of his own grandmother, then turned his attention away with a small frown. After that, the trials came like tides. First, the school's headmistress called to say little Musa would be withdrawn if fees were not paid, and Halima handed over the little she had for medicine that did not stretch, watching the market bustle and the generator's steady hum swallow the sound of her bargaining. She pawned the ring her husband left her and felt the loss like a theft of memory. Then a woman in a fine Ankara named Mrs. Adetokunbo, who ran a charity that always looked like a glossy magazine, approached with a soft voice and a smile. Different kind of attention. A quiet man in an unmarked car who watched Halima 3 evenings in a row from across the street, making notes with a stylus on a tablet while his driver waited. The third obstacle arrived when one of Adetokunbo's photographers, a young man named Kemi, who smelled of frying oil and spoke like a man who had washed plates in his life, confessed in a whisper to Halima, "They want a prettier story, Mama. They've cut the parts where you gave your plate to the boy." Halima felt her chest twist. The market's laughter had become malicious industry, and the small kindness she had offered, handing a child's scrap to another hungrier child, was now erased for better advertising copy. Who was the man behind the tinted glass, and why did his silence feel like a missed promise? It was in the market later, under the smell of roasted corn and the cadence of danfo horns, that the small seed of kindness was planted and observed. As Kemi the photographer slipped her a portion of jollof he had bought for himself after confessing the edits, Halima turned away and tucked it into the apron of a trembling boy who had been watching with empty eyes, saying softly, "Eat first, then we will talk." Unknown to Halima, a passenger in the car across the street, Sani Okonkwo, who had built towers and telecoms, and who often drove alone to see what his city was like without velvet ropes, was watching through the glass, and his breath fogged the window as the man in the suit realized he had seen something honest in a city of crafted images. Why hide this? He asked himself quietly, and the kindness lodged in his memory like a splinter. Would one small act swing the heart of a man who owned more than the city? The pressure ascended like rain clouds gathering. Mustafa the landlord announced that by dawn on the 4th day a truck would come, and if Halima did not produce 2 months' rent, the furniture, the cot, and perhaps the only keepsakes of her late husband would be taken to the auction yard. The director of the school called threatening to have little Musa expelled if fees were not settled, and the clinic threatened to transfer Musa to a ward that charged triple rates if a deposit was not made immediately. Halima's hands shook as she counted coins that did not add up to medicine, and the 3-day clock that Mustafa had set hummed louder than any generator. She felt the weight of choice pressing into her spine. Accept humiliation for quick money, or hold to the dignity she'd taught Musa and risk the very roof over their heads. Could dignity outlast the coming dawn? On the second morning of that countdown, the influencer posted a follow-up clip that framed Halima as an opportunist, and comments poured in like mud from gullies. The church courtyard filled with a murmur of people who had once offered blessing but now offered only speculation, and Mrs. Adetokunbo tightened her smile and suggested a healing that required Halima speak on camera to a morning show. "Confess now and be free later," she told her in a whisper that smelled of perfume and paper contracts. Halima, who had already considered low ways out, selling the last of her husband's tools, begging at the junction, or taking a staged apology that would make her a spectacle, found herself faced with a crossroads. By dawn, something would end, either their home or their dignity. Who would count for more when hunger howled? Then the man at the tinted window revealed what no billboard and no charity brochure could show. Sani Okonkwo stepped out of his car at the market, sandals on his feet, his designer jacket full, dead over his arm, and he walked toward Halima with a calm that felt like thunder. The twist was not only that Sani was the billionaire owner of the gated estate, the telecommunications towers, and a dozen names in the papers. He was also the silent bystander who had seen the original push at the gate and the subsequent kindness Kemi had recorded. "I built the gate and those lights," he said to Halima with his voice low and sincere, "but I never saw the heart behind a plate until today." And the revelation that a man with that much money had watched and been moved reframed the whole story. The power to make things right was suddenly in one pair of hands. Halima felt hope and suspicion in equal measure. Could a man with towers truly understand a woman's hunger, or was this another glossy rescue? For a moment, the world grew colder as new pressures surfaced and everything threatened to slide back into loss. Mrs. Adetokunbo, sensing exposure, filed an injunction claiming Halima had misrepresented her charity and demanded damages, while the influencer threatened a defamation suit if Halima recanted on camera, trying to force a settlement that would keep Halima silent, polished, and profitless. Halima sat on a cracked mat and considered selling the bed to pay for silence. But her memories of her husband and the lessons she had given Musa, "Never trade truth for coins," rose inside her like prayer, and she thought of the boy who had been given Kemi's jollof. In the room of worst options, she found the smallest light. She would choose the truth, even if the truth cost her everything immediate. Dignity had been the compass handed to her by a life of small, honest trades, and she could not betray that. Could truth be enough when the law and the hungry clocks were against her? All seemed lost when the morning show ran the influencer's version, and the city laughed anew, and Adetokunbo's lawyers moved to attach Halima's meager belongings for the alleged losses of the charity's brand image. Mustafa came with a moving truck, and Halima watched her few possessions stacked like an accusation against the sky. The darkest moment burned when little Musa, feverish and frightened, whispered, "Grandma, I am hungry." And Halima, with an ache in her chest that felt as if it would break, held his hands and refused to sign the thin paper that would sell her silence for a temporary roof. She chose instead to stand in the market and tell the truth to anyone who would listen, to show the receipts, the edits, and to speak of the boy who had been given her food, even if it meant the last of her privacy. It was a choice seeded by all the small, honest trade she had made in the marketplace, and it felt like a small, stubborn flame. The climax unfolded on the third day when Sani called a press conference in a courtyard usually reserved for sermons, and he played a full video, uncut, found on a hard drive tucked in his car, showing not only the shove at the gate, but the moments of kindness Halima had offered, the edits Kemi had confessed, and the staged photographs Adetokunbo's team had used to commercialize pain. "You cannot sell someone else's sorrow for profit," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of generators and the dusty red earth where market women gathered, "and you cannot hide behind charity while you exploit the vulnerable." On screen, the socialites' mask slipped, and sponsors began dialing back contracts. The influencers' followers unfollowed in a breath, and the charity's bank accounts froze under investigation. The cameras caught Mrs. Adetokunbo's face as the truth landed, public disgrace that would cost her status, partnerships, and dignity, just as Halima had lost and then reclaimed hers. The final strike of justice was not only public exposure but material consequence. Sani arranged immediate restitution, rental arrears paid, hospital bills cleared, and a small trust set for Musa's schooling. Then he went further, using his legal counsel to file a complaint that recovered funds from the charity that had profited off Halima's story and directed them to a community fund for grandmothers. The antagonist's consequence was sharp and visible. Adetokunbo's charity lost its licenses pending audit, the influencer's agency terminated his contracts, and Mustafa, who had been pressured by the city council to show compassion, found his name tied to a scandal and his tenant list under review. On the street where Halima had once stood with a borrowed wrapper, people watched as a truck returned her belongings, not as spoils but as restitution, and Halima felt the strange new sound of applause from those who had once watched her fall. In the quiet days that followed the storm, Halima's new normal settled like a slow planting. Sani funded a small community kitchen where Halima served free plates twice a week and taught cooking to young women who had little else, and little Musa received a scholarship to a nearby school that had been closed to them only weeks before. The generator that used to be a background hum now powered a tiny training room where market skills were taught without the hunger for PR, and the red earth of their yard was smoothed into a small flower patch that Halima tended as she once had tended grief. Market bustle still threaded every day. Danfo horns still measured the hours, but now the courtyard held a table where dignified meals were offered and faces recognized. Halima noticed the difference in how people now looked at her. Not with the thrill of spectacle, but with the steady, complicated respect that comes when wrongs are righted in public and families are kept whole. Where the old had been a single miserable clip that could be monetized, the new life had contracts with care, not contracts of silence. Halima's kitchen had rules. No cameras without consent, no edits that lie, and the city learned, in a small but sharp way, that a billionaire's intervention could be a corrective lens rather than a spotlight for someone else's profit. Sani visited sometimes and would sit on a crate, unbuttoning his jacket, asking about recipes and names, and Halima would say with a small laugh, "You should pay attention to who feeds your heart, not only your stomach." The community that had once divided itself by gossip now turned its hands to stewardship, and little Musa could run past the market shouting with the kind of laughter that patchworks childhoods anew. Kindness, the story showed, was not a currency to be spent on PR. It was a seed that, if planted honestly, would take root even in red dust and harmattan breath. Truth did not end hunger overnight, but it stopped the machine that would turn need into spectacle and forced a reckoning on those who profited from pain. Never judge a life by one viral clip. A single chapter can lie, but people's choices across a lifetime reveal their true arc. If this story moved you, tell me what you would have done in Halima's place in the comments, and if you want another tale from the markets, mosques, and gates of our cities, subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you warm and ready. Dawn found the market waking with a stubborn clatter of kettles and the rattle of metal carts, the air still tasting of rain on dry dirt, and the first scent of coffee blooming from a sun-warmed pot. And Halima stood at the edge of the lane where the stalls began to bloom like bright petals, watching the city rehearse its new script. Yesterday's humiliation had become today's quiet vow. And I, in the hush between the generator's growl and the distant choir of morning prayers, she felt the ground shift under the weight of consequences that finally began to reflect the truth she had guarded for so long. The press conference Sani had announced the day before rolled out on the small TV in the market office and in every home where a generator glowed like a guardian at dusk, and Halima listened as he spoke not as a prince who owned towers, but as a man who had learned to listen to the heartbeat of a single grandmother and to the child who clung to her skirt when a camera flashed. He spoke of restitution in clear terms: 2 months' rent paid, the hospital bills met, Musa's schooling secured. Then he named the true culprit behind the strings that had pulled the charity's mask over Halima's life, a board that had measured a grandmother's worth in likes, not in loaves. A system that had turned a rescue into a revenue stream and then sent the bill to the person who had nothing left to give but her name and her stubborn honesty. The city's hush had its own weather. Doorways opened a crack to listen. Shopkeepers leaned closer to the screens, and a few men in suits shifted in their chairs as though the truth might burn a hole through their polished upholstery. In a moment that felt both intimate and dangerous, Halima watched the clip feed from the night before, the unedited sections trimmed from the glossy cut. and she felt the weight of that truth resting on her shoulders like a coat too heavy to carry but too necessary to shed. She did not blink, not even when the screen showed the boy who had been fed the jollof, the memory of his eyes bright with a first hunger that had not asked for permission to be seen. It was not a victory lap. It was a moment in which the city decided which of its stories would be told with dignity and which would be forced into a poster. The interval that followed felt like a new hour in a clock tower. Sani did not just speak and disappear. He moved behind the scenes with a dancer's poise, quiet consultations, careful edits, and a ledger that grew heavier with each name he crossed off as a beneficiary of his newly minted trust. He did not pretend to be Halima's savior in the way a borrowed cape would pretend to be a hero. Instead, he laid out a framework that made the rescue a shared obligation and a lasting obligation, a foundation in which a grandmother's kitchen could feed not just bodies, but futures. The first day after the conference, Halima found a notebook on her doorstep, the cover worn from rain and years of small, stubborn chances. Inside were steps, not promises. How to turn the market's midday jitter into a weekly class for nutrition and literacy. How to convert the charity's money into a microgrants program for women who could start small. How to measure success not by viral clips, but by children who slept with their bellies full and their questions uncluttered by fear. The notebook did not erase the past, nor pretend that the road ahead would be smooth. It offered a map that asked for a journey they would have to take together, and Halima could feel Musa tugging at her sleeve with a wish shaped like a question. "Grandma, will the hungry be fed tomorrow if we feed them today?" She smiled into the half-light of the kitchen and nodded, though she knew that tomorrow would still bring the test of whether a city's conscience could stand the long, patient work of repair rather than the dramatic snap of revelation. The second turning point arrived not with fanfare, but with a ledger's whisper. Adeto Kunbo's charity, once a glossy rumor in a ballroom, now drew the careful lines of auditors' pens and the cold gaze of a contract lawyer who spoke in numbers Halima could not read at first, but whose result she could feel in the tremor of Musa's breath at night, and in the way the rent of the old room no longer gnawed at her heart with the certainty of a noose. The city eyes that had welded Halima to a single moment of spectacle began to glimmer with a more patient recognition. A grandmother was not a prop in someone else's advertisement. She was the anchor of a family that had learned to survive on a thread of courage, and if the city could be moved to tears and then to action by an unfiltered truth, it could also be moved to sustain that truth when the cameras were off and the screens were dim. The midsection of the story widened as Halima walked the market lanes with Kemi the photographer's confession still echoing in her ears, the pain of knowing that a story she had believed in for its humanity had been repurposed for profit. And, in that space between regret and resolve, she found a new ally in a neighbor who had kept faith by quietly stocking medicines, passing food, and teaching older women to count coins as numbers, not as shame. The man in the tinted car, who used to watch from across the street and jot notes on a tablet as if measuring a life against a warranty, now stood near the gate with his own questions burning away the last of his cynicism. He did not smile exactly, but there was something in his posture that suggested the city's elegant idea of mercy could be an engine and not a mere ornament. The third obstacle in this ledgered miracle arrived when the state's notices went up, and the city council's hands trembled at the rumor that a public meal could become a right rather than a privilege, that a grandmother's table could turn into a school for the poor, while the old rent abstractedly hovered like a storm cloud over a village square where every stall sold hope as well as grain. A bank in a glass tower sent a letter asking for proof of the charity's good standing, which Halima could not provide in the way a bank would demand, but Sani's counsel could, proof that the money had not vanished into a vanity project, but had found a home in the cinder-block kitchen walls that now bore the marks of hot pots, steam, and the laughter of Musa and his friends. The stress did not vanish with the receipt of a paper. It intensified as the court of public opinion, gossipers, the gatekeepers of social capital, the aunties who measured a life in likes, took notice that the story's new arc had not unwrapped neatly. It had become a fabric in which every thread mattered and every thread could pull toward justice. Yet there was a light, and it came through a phone call Halima hadn't expected. Sani's voice softened by the weight of responsibility, asking to meet at the market's edge where they could speak without cameras, not for credit or applause, but for the truth you carry. He did not deliver a sermon. He offered a kitchen plan, a curriculum, and a promise to finance a scholarship for Musa that would never be paused by a rumor or a charity's misfortune again. When Halima asked him why he cared enough to fight for her and for the others who had learned to count on him only to be pulled into the glare of a spotlight, he answered simply, "Because I remember my grandmother, who fed strangers with the pot that cooked the rain from the rooftops of our youth." It was enough to turn a city's heart toward endurance and to teach the young that power could be tempered by mercy when it was exercised in the open, not behind closed doors. The immediate payoff came not as a single event, but a cascade of tangible shifts. The old room, once a symbol of potential eviction, had its rent fully covered for 6 months by the new trust. Musa's scholarship began with a first-year grant and a weekly tutoring hour that Halima herself taught with a ladle in one hand and a chalk in the other. The market kitchen, which had been a plan and a prayer, became a bustling place where recipes were shared and futures planned, a small school for those who could not attend the formal one because of fees or fear, and the nearby school opened a funded satellite program for children in their community, a safe corridor from the gate to the classroom. The community's perception shifted as well. Where the crowd had once gathered to watch a grandmother perform hunger as a spectacle, they now gathered to learn how to transform hunger into nourishment, how to stretch a meal into a future, how to ensure that a story would not belong to a single thread of sorrow, but to a quilt of shared resilience. In the market's midday bustle, Halima found a new piece that did not erase pain but gave it shape. A mentor's voice for young women who wanted to cook, fix nets, or mend more than holes in their lives. A space where the rattle of a Danfo horn was a countdown to a bell that would ring for a class rather than a confession. A yard once red with rain and regret now tended with herbs and flowers that glowed green in the sun and reminded everyone that growth happens in stubborn spots, not only in perfect plots. And Sani, who had built towers and learned to listen to a grandmother's breath, did not become a distant savior, but a neighbor who carried a bucket of hot water to the clinic, who read the school's notes aloud to Musa's class when the wind blew cold, who reminded Halima, again and again, that mercy without accountability was a luxury a city could not afford. If the interval beat had been about a single moment of exposure turning a life around, the present beat was about a lifetime of trust made visible. The city's gates no longer merely opened for a rescue. They opened for a shared enterprise where the wealthy could still own property and influence, but the people who owned their own meals and their children's futures could now demand a floor under their feet and a microphone that did not silence their voices. Yet the story did not pretend that every problem had vanished, or that a single win could inoculate the city against future predation by those who would profit from pain. It was honest enough to show that Halima would still walk the streets with the same watchful eyes she had always worn, that Musa would still navigate the tightrope between childhood and responsibility, that Cami would still have to answer for the edits her own conscience could not erase, and that the man in the car with the tablet would have to choose between cynicism and the memory of the grandmother who had fed a hungry child with the last of her strength. The last act of this chapter did not end with a thunderclap. It began with a quiet night when the market lanterns flickered and Halima and Musa sat on the doorstep with the new scholarship envelope between them, and as they spoke of lessons learned and meals shared, A soft, almost unspoken agreement settled between them that the city's wealth would not determine their worth anymore. Not if they learned to claim their own names and to tell their own stories with honesty. The night ended with laughter that sounded like rain on zinc roofs, and with Halima whispering to Musa that dignity was not a prize to be bought, but a practice, a morning promise in a city that could still choose mercy even after it had learned to fear exposure. And in the distance the towers glowed with a pale, unhurried light, as if to remind the city that power was most meaningful when it moved from the glass of the boardroom to the warmth of a humble kitchen, from the promise of headlines to the quiet arithmetic of breakfast and school fees paid, from the one viral moment that taught a lesson to the long, durable work of repairing a life day by day. The interval beat had given Halima a partner in Sani whose ambition was now aligned with her own, and the twist that had reshaped a thief of dignity into a custodian of hope had proven that wealth could turn toward justice when its owner listened to the hunger in a grandmother's voice, and the last lines rested here, with Musa's small hand in Halima's, the market's rhythm returning to its ordinary tempo, and the city finally learning to count not the views of a clip, but the true cost and the true reward of kindness expressed in real lives. If this story moved you, tell me what you would have done in Halima's place in the comments. And if you want another tale from the markets, mosques, and gates of our cities, subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you warm and ready. The interval beat whispered through the night. The truth had broken open the gate, but it was mercy that kept the door ajar.